You're listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit ppe.mercatus.org.
Hello, I am Dr. Virgil Henry Storr. It's February 26th, and I have the pleasure of having a conversation with Dr. Chamlee-Wright, who is the provost and dean of the college at Washington College in Eastern Shore, Maryland. And we started off talking about your time at George Mason University and your graduate training at George Mason. But after George Mason, you ended up building your career essentially at liberal arts colleges. You talked about Beloit College as being important in your field work in Zimbabwe, for instance, and being giving you the opportunity to be over there with undergraduates as a part of their programs. And then I introduced you at the beginning as being the provost and dean of the college at Washington College, another liberal arts college. And so the question is, what's special about liberal arts colleges?
That's a great question. It's a little bit like asking, what's special about your mother? You know, there's a lot that's special about my mother, and it's hard to know where to begin. But what drew me was a sense that teaching mattered, and mattered most. And I knew that my comparative advantage was in teaching. And so it just seemed like a rational choice to make initially. But as my time went on there, what I really appreciated about particularly the culture at Beloit College, is that it was a place that drew, fiery, thoughtful young people who mostly really approached the world from a kind of progressive leftist perspective. And it was so exciting to be able to introduce the economic way of thinking to people who genuinely cared about the world and the state of the world. And it didn't matter to me that when I encountered them initially, they had never either thought much about economics, or if they had, their assumptions were that bad stuff happens in the market, and that's and capitalism is bad. I loved working with students who entered into the conversation from that perspective, because what it allowed me to do was to really hone my skills as a teacher, because what I had to do was to really work hard to make sure that I understood that they were operating from a particular paradigm, that we could be looking at the same data and they would see one story or one narrative emerge and I would be seeing another. And it forced me to be very careful in the way that I approached the topics, that I didn't take anything for granted, that I was respectful for the thought process that had led them to the point where they were, and it taught me that in that process, that what was important was not that they walked away persuaded to hold the same policy conclusions that I held. That was actually not at all satisfying. I think I had kind of tried that on a little bit in my when I was teaching as a graduate student, and it was very, very unsatisfying because you get a devotee who immediately gloms on to your conclusions, and you realize you can't talk to them, right? It's like, because they don't ever push back. It's like talking to Jell-O, right? It's just it isn't exciting because there isn't any pushback. They're not thinking deeper about the challenges that you're putting in front of them. And so I loved working with students who had an initial kind of pushback response to the economic way of thinking. And it made me a better economist. It made me a better teacher. And in the course of that, I really started to fall in love with liberal education. I came into it with a love of the economic way of thinking and really with the zeal to bring that economic way of thinking to these people who thought about the world carefully and deliberately. And that's still there. But I ended up in a place that recognized that, how wonderful that I get to teach next to colleagues who are doing exactly the same thing, but it's really trying to, but they're doing it from the humanities perspective. That they're teaching Shakespeare with the same sense of, I can really help emancipate this mind if they take seriously this Shakespearean text, and across the board, across the sciences and social sciences and arts, being able to work with people who come at it with the same sense of commitment from their and love of their own discipline, but openness to the intellectual enterprise, was really exciting, and that's always stuck with me as being what's special about a liberal arts environment.
But you continued while you were there, so it's not uncommon for teachers in liberal arts colleges to also continue to do research. But you ended up doing a lot of research, right? You wrote 3 books, did dozens of articles and what have you. So why continue to research at that pace, I guess, or to that extent?
I think it's because I've always been interested in what drives me is to be a part of good conversations. It's and I want to be clear that early on in your career, it's hard to know what motivates you, right? I mean, because you got to get your dissertation done, and then you've got to get a job, and then you've got to get tenure, and then maybe at some point you're also thinking about promotion to full. Somewhere along the way, you should figure out. You're going to figure out how much of this is push and how much of this is pull. How much of it is that you're doing this because of the external constraints versus this is what you're really drawn to. And it was a truly liberating moment when I did reach full professor. I was awarded full professor at Beloit. And I said, oh, that's great. I'm really honored and that's wonderful, but I got to go to work on something, right? And that there was a next opportunity, the next thing that we wanted to get going, and I wanted to write. And I did stop in the middle of working on that first paper beyond promotion, and I said, this is so cool. I mean, there is no external pressure on me, none whatsoever, absolutely none, and I'm more driven than ever. And I think that it's good for young scholars to know that it can be easy to forget that there is an internal drive to do this work, and that's and what I love about doing this kind of work at a liberal arts college is that because you don't have the pressure to do as much in terms of quantity, it really can be the quality work that you want to do. I got to a point where I stopped worrying about how much I was doing, and instead was only asking the question, is this the most important work I can be doing? Is this the kind of work that's the most interesting to me? And I felt really blessed to be at a liberal arts college because I knew that's all I had to do. And the quantity I knew was fine. It was really working on the quality of the work that was really a true blessing. And going back to the sort of underlying thing is I like to be part of conversations, and I'm more about the next conversation than the last one. I don't do well at self-promotion. I don't promote my books well at all. It's probably a real failing of mine, in part because by the time the book comes out, I really want to be thinking about and doing and talking about the next thing that I'm interested in. But being a part of conversations has always been the basis of my deep friendships, like my deep friendship with you. It's part of what makes for a happy marriage that I've been in for 20 years is that we have really good conversations. It's how we're raising our kids is, what I really want out of my kids is good conversation partners. And scholarship is another kind of conversation. It's an exciting kind of conversation because it's different than the ephemeral, in the moment conversation that you have with the spoken word. With the written word, you do have the opportunity to get it exactly right. You do have the challenge of fitting within a particular structure and constraint. And I like that challenge, and I wouldn't want all my conversations to be that way, but I do love that dimension of conversation, to be engaged in the broader conversation in the discipline.
And so in recent years, you've actually transitioned, though, from the classroom. You've done more administration. Before you left Beloit, you were doing administration to a certain extent, and then now you're a provost. So why administration?
I think that it goes back to it's in part the question of what's special about liberal arts colleges is part of the answer. But something we haven't talked about, which I think is another kind of thread that matters for any graduate of George Mason and in the economics program, is that there is a respect and love of freedom, and there's a way in which the economic way of thinking is tied to freedom, but it's tied to freedom in two ways. One is that there's the sense that if people understood economics better, they would understand why a free society is a good society. They would understand the links between, at least for me, what was exciting about the connections between freedom and the economic way of thinking initially when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student is that freedom is the pathway to prosperity. Freedom is the pathway to flourishing lives for all people, not just a segment of society, but for all members of society. That freedom, in its fullest sense, would is the essential ingredient to the good society. And so, if people understood the economic way of thinking as being part of the package of what it means to be in a free society, that would be a good thing. So there's that connection for sure. But there's another connection too, and that's that the economic way of thinking is powerfully emancipating intellectually. That once you have it, goes back to what drew you to economics in the first place, is that it is a thing that frees the mind, and it was that respect for economics that pretty quickly, I matured out of the phase where I wanted students to kind of, get with the same kind of free market approach that I was all about. I pretty quickly moved past that, not feeling that was satisfying, because what was much more satisfying was if you could help a student make a move that was intellectually emancipating. It didn't matter whether or not they came away with the same policy conclusion as you. And if you got them to stop and pause and scratch their heads and go, I'm going to have to think about that. And it was even, I would do that with students who disagreed with me at the outset, but I also needed to do that with students who agreed with me at the outset. And then I found that to even be a more pressing obligation on me to be able to do that, is to get them to the point where they didn't allow their ideological commitments to substitute for critical thinking, didn't allow their abilities at critical thinking to substitute for listening really carefully to the analysis of someone that they disagreed with, that a sympathetic listener is someone who says, I don't agree with this person, but I know that person's smart, so I'm going to work really hard to try and understand why it is that they believe what they believe, and really try to understand what is making their logic work, and then I want to pause and I want to think about it, right? If I can make that move, that's what's powerful about economics, and so what I learned over my time at Beloit is that liberal arts colleges were special because that was happening all across campus, not just in the economics department. And as I looked out in, liberal arts colleges are getting beat up left and right from all corners. Literally political left, political right, from political leaders, from higher education specialists. I mean, it's very tough climate for liberal arts colleges, and I saw that there were some within academic leadership that were very, very effective at making the case and of being effective champions of liberal education, and I saw, and I had seen those who were not very successful and who had gone into administration for all the wrong reasons, and I thought, so my love of economics started to transition to being a love of economics and really a love of liberal education, and a champion for economics kind of morphing into being a champion and an advocate for liberal education. And and there are, in my current role, on a day-to-day basis, there's headaches that I wish I didn't have. There's things that I've got to think about and contend with that I was never trained for. But ultimately, it's the care and nurturing and championing of a liberal education that I'm really proud of, and I really feel deeply fortunate to be in a position to be able to do that.
I had a question about actually identity. So you've been a bunch of these things, right? You've been a researcher, a very active one. You've been a teacher, a very good teacher. You're now an administrator. How do you see yourself? Is it some mix of the three? Is that an unfair question? Is that not even an important sort of question to ask?
No, it's a huge thing to ask in terms of anybody who's thinking about a transition into academic leadership should know that that's going to be a thing. The first time you don't get invited to a faculty gathering because you're not considered faculty I'll tell you, it's devastating. It's just absolutely devastating. And even though I'm formally a member of the faculty and a full professor in the economics department, and even if I were to teach, which I find not enough time to do, it still wouldn't be the same. That once you are in an administrative role, your identity must change. But I believe it's up to me as to whether or not I give up the core of what makes me a teacher scholar. And I know a lot of my peers at institutions who say, you really just have to, completely disassociate yourself. You should only have friends with other administrators. You shouldn't have friends on the faculty, that kind of level. And I've consciously decided to not do that. And there will be faculty, for example, who don't consider me part of the body of the faculty, and that's okay, and that's their choice, and I understand that. But what's core to me in terms of my own self-identity is I'm still a teacher scholar, and my teaching looks very different than it once did, and I hope that this is received in the spirit in which I mean it. Is that when I'm working with faculty one-on-one, I'm completely in my teacher headspace, and that doesn't mean that I think of faculty as students. They're not, but in terms of the same spark of imagination, the same love of the intellectual enterprise. I always wanted to treat my students as colleagues, right? And so it's really in that spirit that my colleagues are part of the enterprise of teaching for me. And in terms of the scholarship, I wish I had more time to do more of the scholarship, and I'm hoping that if I do good work, maybe I'll carve out the scope I need to do more. But it's critical to me that I am able to continue to contribute to the scholarly work that has been important to my career so far, because it's the thing that keeps me honest. It's the thing that keeps me engaged with the intellectual enterprise. I think it's a thing that externally can buy me some credibility, but that wouldn't be enough on its own. It's really that if I'm not allowing myself the opportunity to continue to be a part of those scholarly conversations, that's a kind of violence I'd be doing to myself that I don't think is sustainable. So it is really a critical piece of what makes the work of academic leadership sustainable is I have to be able from time to time to re-engage with the scholarly conversation. So survival, I think, is the answer to the question as to why I still do that.
Thank you. So that's the end of my formal questions. But while I still have you here and we're still recording, 3 unfair questions.
Yes.
That you knew of young Peter Bettke.
Mm-hmm.
What was Pete like when he was a graduate student? I guess you were still an undergraduate.
And I was an undergraduate in those days. And he was among those who I'm sure I pestered a great deal. What I found remarkable is he was a very young father at that time. And I was paying careful attention to how much of a machine he was for the work. And simultaneously, how committed he was to being a father. And they were young at the time. And that was a big part of the impression I got is that how did he do it? How did he do it all? Because I'd be tired kind of at the end of the day that I thought I was fatigued from doing scholarly work, doing the work of a student. And here this guy was, he was teaching, he was pushing forward on publications in his dissertation, and he was a young dad. I didn't quite know how he made it all work. And that was I'm not sure if awe-inspiring is the word. It was just kind of like, how does that happen? How does a person do that? So it was really a sense of wonder about how he made it all work.
I think that I still have not figured that out, and so if you have any insight, I would love to know. The second unfair question: you knew an even younger Virgil Storr. What was the younger Virgil Storr like?
The younger Virgil Storr. I remember the moment I met the younger Virgil Storr. He was incredibly clean-cut, clean-shaven. You wore a dark brown long-sleeved shirt. I remember the moment, right? That I met you, and you came up and talked to me because I think it was just a straight up econ, intro econ course, right? And this was probably like the first couple of days on the job, and the question you asked me was catapulted me. I don't remember the question, but I remember just the manner in which you were talking to me. I thought, oh my goodness, I hope this is not the modal student because I'm going to be so outclassed so quickly. That I had this image of what the typical freshman would be in my introductory course, and I felt like I could pretty much hold my own. I was not sure that I could with this particular person in my class. Now, I later learned that he had a little bit of an advantage, that he had been in higher education before. He had had a couple of years under his belt that the typical freshman had not had. So, that was a little bit of an exhale at that point. But that was the first moment. But then very quickly he became one of my. He was my first favorite student, and he became a member of the comparative economic systems class that I taught. And I made no bones about it. I tried every way I could to emulate Don Lavoie, and I think of that course as our first course in which you and I shared a relationship with Don, because even though he wasn't in the room, he was in the room. And because he was my teacher of comparative systems, and I had this guy in my class, Virgil, who was a complete and utter Marxist, and he was really, really getting into the first 3 or 4 weeks of the course. It's all about Marx. And remember, I was a Don devotee, so I made sure that it was really Marx centric, and we really focused on the Marx. And the other students would kind of quit back at me and offer their flaccid arguments against Marx, and I would come back and defend Marx, and Virgil liked me at that moment. And then I flipped it, and I started doing the Misesian critique, and he didn't like me anymore for a while. So we had to work through that, but I think we have by this time.
That class changed my life in more ways than you can imagine. So we started off talking about the younger Emily Chamlee-Wright, and we ended the conversation about your career with the current. So what's different about the Emily that would have been, the Emily getting excited about econ for the first time, getting excited about Austrian economics for the first time, worrying about these questions about social learning and sort of figuring out maybe fieldwork something I want to do, and maybe culture is something I want to pay attention to, and this Emily now, both mostly as a scholar and as a teacher, I guess.
Yeah, I think that there's the theme of fearlessness is an interesting theme and arc. I was fearless about some of these choices I was making as a graduate student, mainly because I was too stupid to know better. I fearlessly wrote a book rather than, a series of articles that could then be turned into journal publications for my dissertation. I fearlessly did field work and, embedded myself into context that took a lot of time, and, fearlessly sort of avoided didn't avoid, but fearlessly did this qualitative analysis rather than doing what I was supposed to do, which was the quantitative stuff, all because I didn't know better. I didn't know that I couldn't do that. And along the way, I felt the challenge that posed. Never from the context of working at a liberal arts college. I was always embraced. That work was always embraced. It was always recognized as an asset because it was so interdisciplinary. I was always capable of talking to my colleagues beyond the department, and that made me valuable to them. It made me valuable to my colleagues within the department. So in terms of my career within the liberal arts community, it was never anything that felt like a challenge. But, definitely there were times when, I needed to elbow my way into a conversation, into, so the first part of my first book is really trying to make a case for, why this kind of economics to study economic development, and also why this kind of methodological approach when it's not something economists do. So there's a lot of like laying the ground that you've got to do for yourself, and that can feel alienating. It can feel lonely, and fear-inducing. And where I am now is back to the graduate school version of Emily, in the sense of being just as fearless, but knowingly so, that, it actually did work out, and it has worked out. And in fact, I wouldn't have wanted for myself any other career arc. There's no project that I've worked on that I felt like, well, that was just a shameless bid to, fit in to the discipline. And there's nothing that I did that I'm not proud of. And there's nothing that I've worked on that I didn't have fun doing. And if you can look back, I think of myself as being mid-career, at the first part of your career, and say that, I think that's a good thing. And so I think where I am now is I've, re-embraced that fearlessness that I had as a graduate student, a little wiser than I was before, but so grateful that Don didn't dissuade me from any of those choices. And I feel very, very grateful for his support. And I just want to say too, there were not many women in the program back then, and I think about Don's role in supporting people who had interesting ideas. That was the thing he cared about, and And he never batted an eye about being a mentor to a young woman in the program. And in fact, he saw it as an asset. This is great. This is wonderful that the discipline is getting more diverse. And I think about the work that you're doing with graduate students here. And both in terms of being incredibly supportive of young women in the department, people of color in the department, all those of us who are, somewhat the oddballs, right? You're here to support them. I think Pete is very supportive of that diversity as well. And so in that sense, Don's spirit, in many senses, Don's spirit lives on, but that's an important dimension of what he brought to the table that I'm so grateful for as an alumna of the program. And as a board member of Mercatus, that I'm just so grateful to see that aspect of Don's commitment really carrying on.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the F.A. Hayek Program, visit ppe.mercatus.org.